Patrick be with you all. We're here to talk about the Irish Brigade in the American Civil War. It occurred to me that there would be a number of people here who had no bloody idea what the hell a brigade was. So I thought I would begin with a sort of military primer. In the Civil War, a company of troops at full strength consisted of 100 men. A regiment consisted of 10 companies, therefore 1,000, although very few regiments were ever actually at 1,000. And once they'd been in combat, for reasons that will become clear, they would never be at 1,000 ever. A brigade usually consisted of 3 or more regiments. As the war went on and the regiments got smaller, the brigade would have 5 or 6 or 7, whatever was necessary, to bring it up to maybe even half of a normal brigade strength. A division consisted of 2 or more brigades, a corps consisted of a minimum of 2 divisions, and an army consisted of 2 or more corps. Now, how the hell did these people know who they were? How did they know where they were and where they were supposed to be? Well, part of it was the flags. And in several of these pictures, you'll see the flags. And the flags, after the first 20 minutes of the battle, were not flags anymore, because bullets passed through them with considerable inconsiderable volume, and they became rags. Nevertheless, they were proudly held. Men volunteered to carry the flags. When a battle was over or things were going badly, the flags were placed and the regiment rallied on the flag. It was very dangerous to carry a flag. You were a target. And yet there was never a shortage of people who were willing to carry the flag. The honor was considered that great. But I said, how did you know who you were? And I'm going to show you that. This is a replica kepi. The Army of the Potomac wore not the broad black hats that you frequently see, but this, which is modeled on the French kepi. This is an artillery kepi. You can tell that by the red stripe that signifies artillery. Now, this is from the 2nd Corps. All designations came from the Corps. There was a very great soldier named Philip Kearny who had fought long before the Civil War. He was a general briefly in the Civil War until he was killed. He had lost an arm in battle, and he was one of those people who literally rode into battle on his horse with the reins in his teeth so he could have his gun, his pistol, or his saber. This is an artillery kepi, both the red and the cross cannons. If it was cavalry, you would have yellow and you would have cross sabers. If it was infantry, you would have blue and you would have cross what? No, that's much later. Bugles. Bugles symbolize the infantry in the Civil War. And I'm sorry about that. I won't do anything that nasty again. But in any event, now you have a sort of primer on how they knew everybody. Something in excess of 200,000 men served in the Union Army during the Civil War. Perhaps as many as 25%, something in excess of 2 million men served in the Civil War, and perhaps as many as 25% of those were foreign-born. The largest single number of foreign-born were not Irish. They were German, which is in tribute to my wife. The Irish were next at about 150,000. New York provided more Irish soldiers to the Union than any other state, which is hardly surprising. New York had been for a long time the most populous state in the Union. It was a great port city, and in great port cities like Boston, Philadelphia, New York is where the immigrants tended to congregate, especially if, like the Irish, they were not farmers. And the Irish, because of the conditions in which the English kept Ireland, really had no farming skills. The most famous of the Irish units was the Irish Brigade. It was formed under the command of an exiled Irish nationalist, Brigadier General Thomas Francis Marr, known as Mar of the Sword. This, by the way, is Mar leading the 69th and the Irish Brigade into battle at Antietam. The 150th anniversary of Antietam, of course, is tomorrow, which is why we chose this date. The fact that tomorrow is also St. Patrick's Day has nothing to do with it. Of the 5 men who would command the brigade during the war, 3 would die. The story properly begins in 1851 with the formation of the 69th Regiment New York State Militia. There was no National Guard, in spite of what newspapers say. There was militia in those days. The National Guard doesn't exist until the 1870s. The regiment was composed primarily, virtually entirely, of Irish Catholic immigrants. In 1859, Michael Corcoran was appointed colonel of the regiment. On October 11, 1860, the New York City militia units were all ordered to parade in honor of the visit of the Prince of Wales, the son of Queen Victoria, later King Edward VII of England. And all of the regiments did parade, with the exception of the 69th New York, to whom Corcoran never gave any orders to fall out and parade. There was no way they would parade for the son of the Queen of England, not in those days. Corcoran was then placed under arrest, and orders were issued for his court-martial. The immediate sequence of events tended to change that. Okay, October of 1860, November of 1860, Lincoln was elected president. December of 1860, the southern states began to secede. February 1861, the Confederacy is formed in Alabama. April of 1861, Confederate forces fire on Fort Sumter, and somehow people decided that the charges against Corcoran weren't all that significant, that the 69th needed to go to the relief of Washington, and Corcoran was placed back in command. One result of this is that 6,000 men volunteered for the 69th. Remember, a regiment is only 1,000 men. 1,000 were accepted, later reinforced by our friend Mar, who was in command of 300 Zouaves, which would be, in effect, 3 company size, but dealt with as a company under the circumstances. They paraded out of New York under the national flag and the green banners of Irish nationalism. One of the great symbols on those flags, if you look around later you can see it, is the harp of Ireland. And the great thing to note in the flags is the harp is uncrowned. In the English heraldry, the harp of Ireland is crowned with the crown of England, signifying Ireland's subsidiary position to the English crown. So the harp on this flag was uncrowned. Interestingly enough, regiments, the colors for regiments normally were the national colors, the Stars and Stripes, and the state flag. The Irish had permission, the Irish Brigade had permission to carry its green banners with it, and so it did. At this point, they formed into a division which was under the command, interestingly enough, of William Tecumseh Sherman, who will play a relatively significant portion later in the war. Ambrose Burnside, who later, as commander of the Army of the Potomac, would get a great many of the people of the Irish Brigade killed, wrote, quote, "It was Sherman's brigade and the 69th New York in the advance, with the most deadly fire which broke the enemy's lines." This is the early part of the battle. After that, Stonewall Jackson came onto the field, and as Colonel B said, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall. At even charges, the 69th were unable to break Jackson's Virginians. They did charge with the motto, shouting the motto in Gaelic of the 69th New York, Fa Mala, clear the way. But they failed and took casualties in the course of doing that. The 69th retired in good order during the retreat. Some books will say they covered the retreat. Quite frankly, the retreat was not that well organized. They performed well, and insofar as there was coverage for the retreat, they gave it. But it was a mad scramble to get the hell back to Washington. They were all panicked. None of these guys had ever done anything more than militia service. Militia is not nearly as well trained as a modern National Guard. They were on 90-day service. You got to remember that people took this seriously. Some of the regiments that were marching to the First Battle of Bull Run hit the 90th day and just turned around and headed back. Others voted and decided, well, they would go along because they thought it would be fun and exciting. Turned out to be exciting. Whether it was fun or not is another matter. But in any event, the 69th retired in good order during the retreat. The campaign saw casualties of 192 killed, wounded and missing, a casualty rate of roughly 15%. Their 90-day service having expired, the 69th went back to New York City. Lincoln now called upon the nation for 500,000 volunteers for 3 years' service. In response to that call, the 69th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment was called into being. This is not the 69th Militia. They're still in New York. Okay? They can be called up for service, but these are people who have chosen to sign up for 3 years with the 69th New York Volunteers. Okay? Significant difference. It was decided that an Irish Brigade would be recruited, and they added the 63rd. One of the companies, the 63rd, if memory serves me, K Company, was heavily recruited in Albany. In any event, the 63rd and the 88th regiments were also formed, and on February 6, 1862, Brigadier General Thomas Francis Marr took command of the brigade. The 88th, by the way, for reasons unknown to me, was known as Mrs. Marr's Own. At least 1/3 of the troops in the brigade had previously served in the British Army, many in the Crimean War in 1854-55, others in the Indian Mutiny of 1857. Parenthetically, I would note that of the 5,000 men who would muster in the brigade, these regiments, the three, plus the 28th Massachusetts and 116th Pennsylvania, only 700 would be present at muster at the war's end. Not only these regiments as they were, but whatever replacements, which weren't many that they got. I want to say a few words about the battle, but I think a few general remarks about the idea of the Irish Brigade are necessary at this point. For Marr, and for many others, perhaps most, Civil War service was not only a war of gratitude to the adopted land, it was also to be a training, a preparation for a later war to free Ireland. Thus the oft-quoted remark among soldiers, and you'll forgive my attempt at a brogue, but boys, if we were fighting for the poor old Dart, wouldn't it be grand? Close quote. In that context, the formation of the Irish Brigade owes much to the history of Ireland and of Irish nationalism in the era. Much of the emotional power that drew Irishmen to the brigade came from that idea. The long European history of Irish brigades in continental armies begins in the late Elizabethan period with the flight of the earls and the first drifting of what came to be called the wild geese, the young men of Ireland who left the country where there was little hope for them and took military service in continental units. In Spain, but particularly after the defeat in 1690 at the Battle of the Boyne, when the Stuart cause was lost and Patrick Sarsfield, who was the commander of the Irish fighting forces at that time, agreed to the treaty, and among the terms of that treaty that they had lost in fighting, they would be allowed to leave Ireland unmolested. And they left and they went into continental service. The most famous of the Irish brigades, although there were Irish brigades in the Spanish army, in the Habsburg army, the most famous of the Irish brigades was in the French army. And they served the kings of France very well until they were disbanded at the start of the French Revolution, when the revolutionaries realized that they had to get rid of the Irish Brigade because whatever else the Swiss and the other guards might do, the Irish would fight for the king. The French monarchs gave them, any former Marines here? Here. What's the motto of the Marine Corps?
Semper Fi.
It's always faithful. The French kings gave to the Irish Brigade, before there was an American Marine Corps, the motto, Semper et ubique fidelis, always and everywhere or in all things, faithful. This is the idea and the name of the Irish Brigade, and our Irish Brigade is consciously modeled upon its European predecessor. So it has heavy emotional content. In a very real sense, what we do here today validates what Marr and the others set out to do when they created the brigade. In 1862, the Irish Brigade was created for the war, and for history, and for the Union, but also for the bards. It was created to be remembered. The first campaign of the Irish Brigade was in the Peninsular Campaign under General McClellan in the spring of 1862 in Virginia, an attempt to take Richmond and end the war. They quickly established a reputation as an elite fighting unit. There is, of course, a drawback to having a reputation as an elite fighting unit, which is the fact that when everybody is in trouble, they send for the elite fighting unit. General Sumner, their first corps commander, before the beginning of a battle would frequently say, "Are the green flags ready?" General Fitzjohn Porter, it was said, quote, kindled into rapture as they came cheering into battle at the Battle of Malvern Hill. They were, in general, healthier than other troops. They were healthier than other troops because they were city boys. Most of the people who joined the Union Army were farmers. And if you were a farmer, you had never been subjected to diseases of overcrowding. You didn't know typhus, you didn't know typhoid, and therefore you had no immunity. City boys, who were usually not as tall, not as brawny, all that good kind of stuff, little bitty germs would take them down like nobody's business. And it's important to remember that in the American Civil War, far more men died of disease than ever died of any injury imposed on a battlefield. Better than 3 to 1. Okay. They were generally poised. They had wonderful endurance. They once marched, for example, 54 miles within 21 hours of marching time, which is not bad. They were cool in battle, strong unit pride. On the other hand, there were less desirable traits. Waste, for example. If action impended, they would throw everything away except what they needed to carry into battle, which is, by the way, not uncharacteristic of American troops in the Second World War as well. And there were problems, believe it or not, of intemperance and concomitant disorder. They also were reluctant to accept discipline. Their earliest engagements, as I said, were on the peninsula in May of June of '62. At Fair Oaks, as they came out of the field, General Sumner shouted to them, "Boys, I'm your general. I know the Irish Brigade will not retreat. I stake my stars on you." And the position held. At Gaines Mill, McClellan, in deep trouble, threw in his reserve. Charging behind the green flags, the brigade drove back attacking rebels and enabled the Union Army to rally. A Lieutenant Turner, who was a member of the Irish Brigade, wrote about this. He said, and I quote, "We were sent for. We are the reserve. And it's only when the black need comes that we press forward. The dead, the beaten, the wounded lie in our path. But our cheer reanimates them. Our elan gives them hope. I pledge you my word that when the Irish Brigade approaches, the hearts of that portion of the army that sees them are moved. The most grateful and glad cheers greet us all the way. And weak and broken and bent men, reassured, join in our ranks and go on with renewed courage to the fight." At Malvern Hill, a climactic battle, as the brigade came charging onto the hill, the Confederate general, perhaps less romantic than Lieutenant Turner, said, "Steady, boys, here come those goddamn green flags again." While the Irish Brigade gained honor and took casualties, the Peninsular Campaign, of course, was a failure. The Army was withdrawn, partly simply to take it away from McClellan's command and give it to General Pope in Northern Virginia. The Irish Brigade remained behind and arrived too late to take part in the Second Battle of Bull Run in July of 1862. In the wake of the disaster at Second Bull Run, Lincoln felt for the morale of the Army of the Potomac, he had no choice but to restore McClellan to command, and so he did. On September 2nd, McClellan reassumed. McClellan was an incredibly popular general, probably the most popular general the United States ever had. The troops loved him. He took what had been a mob, he made an army out of it, he created Union pride for it. The only thing he couldn't do was fight. McClellan, I think, had created this army he loved and he was afraid for it. And as a result, he got a lot more guys killed than a more aggressive general would have. Be that as it may, September 2nd he reassumes command, and on September 13th he gets a copy in his hand of Robert E. Lee's campaign for the invasion of Maryland. He realizes almost instantly that Lee has divided his army into three pieces, and that McClellan is in fact closer to all those pieces than they are to one another. He is overjoyed. He is basically convinced that he will lick Bobby Lee. Of course, McClellan was never going to lick anybody. McClellan moved, but not quickly enough. By the 15th, McClellan not yet moving, Lee was already at Sharpsburg on the Antietam Creek in Maryland with 18,000 men and consolidated. By the 16th, Stonewall Jackson and his troops had joined. Still not complete, but when all his troops were up, Lee would have no more than 40 or 45,000 men. McClellan would have 90,000 and more. Still couldn't pull it off. On September 17th, Lee having had time, McClellan was finally ready to attack. The bloodiest day in the history of all of America's wars. Before it ended, more than 12,000 Union and 10,000 Confederates would be killed, wounded, or missing. 23,000 casualties in one day. The attack began on the extreme right of the Union line. That element of the Union commanded by the general we generally think of as Fighting Joe Hooker, who is most famous because of Hooker's division in Washington, where ladies in the evening applied their trade and came to be known as Hooker. But in any event, Hooker was not a bad combat commander. He's one of the people where the Peter Principle worked. Up to corps command, Hooker was a good commander. When he became an army commander, he couldn't handle it. But that neither here nor there. This is McClellan's plan, which Hooker has executed. So he attacks the Confederate left. Nobody else in McClellan's army is doing anything. When that attack begins to peter out, when Hooker's corps doesn't have any gusto left, then the Second Corps is sent to attack. What happens, of course, is while Lee is badly outnumbered, he has time to transfer troops from one portion of the battlefield to the other, so that in each place, the overwhelming advantage of numbers that McClellan has is in fact not realized. In any event, McClellan never committed all of his troops that day. He was, as usual, convinced that somewhere, Lee had 50 or 60,000 troops that nobody knew about that were prepared to leap on his back or his flank. McClellan was always convinced of that. The Irish Brigade at Antietam formed a portion of Richardson's division, the first division of the Second Corps. Arguably, at that time, the best division in the Army of the Potomac. And as a result, it would take more casualties than any other unit of the Army of the Potomac. Mid-morning, the Second Corps began its assault, and the Irish Brigade was brought to what's called the Sunken Road. Now, we don't see sunken roads very much anymore because we're not farmers anymore. But when you have nothing but dirt and you roll wagons across it with iron rimmed tires, they create ruts, and every year the ruts get deeper. And in effect, the surface of the road gets lower over a period of time. And it begins to form first a pothole and then indeed potentially a trench. In any event, marling the brigade onto the ridge above the sunken road not knowing about the sunken road or that the Confederates had created a major defensive position there. The plan was to top the ridge, find the enemy, deliver 2 volleys. Got to pause here for a minute again. Marr insisted that the Irish Brigade be armed with smoothbore muskets with buck and ball. Okay, by this time most units had rifled muskets. Okay, and you could kill almost as efficiently at 200, 300 yards as you can now with modern weapons. Once rifling is introduced, accuracy becomes much, much easier. Buck and ball, you got a smoothbore musket, and into it you put powder, and you put a 65 to 70 caliber ball. Any of you ever seen 50 caliber machine gun bullet? Okay, make that 70, and you got the size of the bullet. Okay. On top of that, you got 3 buckshot. Now, when you fire this at close range, it is a man killer. Okay, it's an absolute man killer. In fact, they did some tests in the late 50s, the early 60s, and if you're talking about a Civil War type rifle and the ability to kill at 200 yards, they got 34 hits on targets out of 50 shots. Okay, with buck and ball at 200, they got I don't remember the number of it, substantially more than 15 to 20% more, simply because you got more projectiles going out. After 200 yards, it doesn't work simply because the muzzle velocity was not great enough for the buck and ball to have killing force after that point. So they were going to get two shots with buck and ball, and then they would go in with the bayonet. When they crested the ridge instead, they were struck by a prodigious volley of rifle fire, which left them no choice but to hit the ground and attempt to return fire. The 69th and 63rd New York regiments, which took the brunt of the assault, would take casualties of over 60% here. 29th Massachusetts, protected by a fortunate dip in the ground, had a few casualties. Ground is not level, even if it appears level. Okay? If you go to Gettysburg, for example, and you look at the field that Lee sent his troops over, you're astonished that any of them survived. But in fact, there is in that field what is called defilade. The ground looks smooth at a distance, but in fact there are places where you go down. There are swales. And when you're in those swales, you can't be hit. Okay, because the fire has to be horizontal. From wherever the point of aim is, it has to go horizontal. And the 29th Massachusetts here was in defilade, so it had an advantage that the 63rd and the 69th did not. There is also, as long as I'm doing this, enfilade. In enfilade, jagged iron line. Okay, this is normally the way a Civil War battle was fought. Now, if somebody can come over here, Jack now can be taken in enfilade. Okay, even if he turns and fires back, the rest of the line can't do it. It has to deploy before it can do it. So if you are, thanks, Jack. If you are in an enfilade position, you're meat on the table for a unit that is loaded and ready to go. Okay. When General Richardson advanced Caldwell's brigade to aid the Irish, the 29th moved and with the other troops began to flank the Bloody Lane. So in fact, the severe losses that the Irish Brigade took produced substantial benefits to the Army of the Potomac because the Confederate position in the sunken road was now in enfilade. Okay. On many Civil War battlefields, men would say, you could walk across the field on the bodies of the dead. At the sunken road, which is in histories of Antietam also known as Bloody Lane, men said, quote, you could not walk without stepping on the bodies of men. The day ended with an apparent stalemate, and Lee taunted McClellan by remaining on the ground on the 18th. If McClellan had attacked, he could have wiped Lee out, and who knows what would happen to the war. Although, interesting enough, slavery might have continued to exist if McClellan had attacked on the 18th. In any event, Lee withdrew to the south on the 19th. Lincoln, who had been looking for a victory in order to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, now, because the Union held the ground and held the battlefield, could in fact issue the Emancipation Proclamation to take effect in January of 1863. At that point, the next great battle of the plan on November 14th. Burnside began movement on the 15th, and by the 17th he had 2 corps at Falmouth. He had marched 2 corps 40 miles in 2 days, with Lee none the wiser. Lee had not moved. Once across the river, Burnside would be closer to Richmond than Lee was to Richmond, and he could potentially interpose himself between Lee and Richmond and make Lee attack him. Unfortunately, he had to cross the river. Now, Burnside had planned this appropriately. Pontoons and engineers for crossing the river were supposed to be at Falmouth when they got there. They weren't. And they didn't come. And they didn't come. And they didn't come. But Lee did. Now, Fredericksburg is superb defensive country. Any force crossing the river has to go uphill, and it has to cross a half a mile of open ground before it can come to grips with its enemy. Joseph Johnston, who was one of the better Confederate commanders, who was not there, but knew the territory, once he knew that Lee was there, summed up how good that territory is. He said, quote, "What luck some people have. Nobody will ever come and attack me in such a place." Longstreet, who was one of Lee's corps commanders, was going to occupy the Confederate left. And once he looked at the position in a place called Marye's Heights, M-A-R-Y-E-S, Marye's Heights, Longstreet considered his position with well-sighted artillery, with his infantry not only in the sunken road, but this sunken road had a stone wall above it, so it's basically an excellent trench system, with the enemy having to assault across a half a mile of open ground. And Longstreet, who was not a braggart, told Lee that the entire Union Army assaulted his position, quote, "I will kill them all." And he probably would have. Lee had much time to prepare. Burnside pontoon bridges were not built until December 11th, a month after they should have been. At this point, Burnside should have called the whole damn thing off. He simply didn't know what to do, and I think moved forward because the plan called for them to move forward. Nothing makes sense at this point. The assault came on the 13th. By then, one of our Longstreet's artillery officers had told him, quote, "Not even a chicken could cross that ground unharmed." You got to picture artillery and rifle fire so intense that men marched into it, hunched over, leaning forward like they're walking into a storm. But still they went. The enemy was 9 to 10 football fields away from where they began. One New York soldier, not of the Iron Brigade, later said, "We might as well try to take Hill." The Army would take 11% casualties. The Irish Brigade would take 41% casualties, mainly because they got closer to the wall than anybody else. Different witnesses had different visions of the assault of the Irish Brigade, but all the witnesses saw uncommon valor. A Union soldier whose regiment had charged before theirs saw them head, quote, "into the thickest of the fight. Every man had a sprig of green in his cap." If you look at this picture here later, which is the 28th Regiment, which was the Massachusetts Regiment, you'll see a sprig of boxwood. In December, they wanted something green. So they broke off boxwood hedges and put them somewhere about their person so that the green of the Irish Brigade would be, in fact, obvious. Every man has a sprig of green in his cap and a half laughing, half murderous look in his eye. They reach within a stone's throw of the stone wall. No more. They try to go on, but are slaughtered. The correspondent of the London Times described it this way, comparing Irish brigades and European armies. "Never, at Fontenoy, Albuera, or Waterloo, was more undaunted courage displayed by the sons of Erin than in this charge, directed against the almost impregnable position of their foe. The bodies, which lie in dense masses within 40 yards of the guns, are the best evidence of what manner of men they were, who pressed on to death with the dauntlessness of a race which has gained glory on 1,000 battlefields, never more richly deserved than at the foot of Marie's Heights on the 13th day of December in 1862. General George Pickett, who a few months later would lead a charge of his own at Gettysburg, wrote to his wife about the charge of the Irish Brigade at Fredericksburg, quote, "Your soldier's heart almost stood still as he watched those sons of Erin fearlessly rush to their death. The brilliant assault on Marie's Heights of their Irish Brigade was beyond description. Why, my darling, we forgot they were fighting us, and cheer after cheer for their fearlessness went up along our lines. But the price was high." General Winfield Scott Hancock, who was their divisional commander that day, mustered his brigades on December 14th, and he noticed three privates of the Irish Brigade standing alone and said, "Men, join your company." And one of them looked at him and said, "Sir, we are a company." Of about 1,300 men Marr had led onto the field, 545 were killed, wounded, or missing. Fredericksburg was a disaster, and in the wake of that disaster, the Army of the Potomac retreated to its camps, and President Lincoln replaced Burnside with Major General Joseph Hooker, sometimes called Fighting Joe Hooker. It's an interesting mistake. Newspapers do things. The copy, the headline was supposed to read, "Fighting, comma, Joe Hooker," meaning there was fighting and Joe Hooker led his troop. The comma was omitted, and thereafter Hooker was fighting Joe Hooker. It's a sort of same way in which Admiral Bill Halsey became Bull Halsey in World War II. He had never been Bull, but a correspondent screwed it up, and he was Bull thereafter. Anyway, under Hooker, the Army would fight its next battle in May of 1863 at Chancellorsville. Once again, a Union commander proved to be inadequate to the task, and defeat ensued. But the Irish Brigade played only a peripheral part at Chancellorsville. Almost precisely 2 months later, July 1st to 3rd, 1863, the Army of the Potomac would engage in its next major battle at Gettysburg under still another commanding officer, General George Gordon Meade, its third commander in 1863. And Meade, by the way, when the battle began, had been in command of the Army for less than 72 hours. At this point, the Irish Brigade reached the field in a strength of about 530 men. That was all that was left. By now, the Irish Brigade had been placed in Caldwell's division, still the 1st Division of the 2nd Corps, and Winfield Scott, who had been their divisional commander, was now their Corps commander. And they would, again, have a difficult time. Of course, they would play an important but diminishing role simply because there were fewer of them each time they went in. Why were they so few? Why were there no replacements, or very few? Well, one of the great problems of the Union Army was replacements, and it stemmed from the way troops were recruited for the Civil War. Regiments were raised by the states, and then, let me add for just a second here, that's not a bad system, because if men were all from the same town or whatever, it gave a lot of unit cohesion. It tended to make them want to behave well so that they would be thought well of by people they've grown up with and all of that sort of stuff. On the other hand, it can cause disastrous losses in the gene pool of a small town. But in any event, then after they had been raised, they were federalized and they were taken into federal service. Well, but when they were raised, they would still belong to the states. So the governor got to appoint a colonel, a couple of lieutenant colonels, some majors. The governors liked that, because people then felt they owed them, and in fact they did. Patronage was in fact at work. This meant that recruiting replacements for veteran, even for elite units, gave no opportunity to patch. They already had their officers. You couldn't provide a colonel for a regiment that already had a commander. The states then rarely, if ever, provided assistance to recruiting efforts for established units. The governors far preferred the patronage opportunity provided by new units. The result was a continual diminution of the strength of veteran units and a flow of new, green, and untried troops into combat. The terrible flaws of the system were compounded by the Army, which associated the ranks of officers with unit strength. So, for example, at Gettysburg, Major St. Clair Mulholland, I love that name, Major St. Clair Mulholland, commanded the 116th Pennsylvania, which was one of the regiments in the brigade. He was an experienced and highly competent combat commander, but he could never be promoted because the 116th would never again have enough men to justify having a colonel in command as the Army saw the situation. As we used to say when I was in the Army, there's the right way, the wrong way, and the Army. Anyway, worse, in case, and this never happened to the Irish Brigade, but it happened to many other brigades, a new Green Regiment might be put in a brigade because the brigade needed more men. But then, if the brigade commander was killed or seriously wounded, command would devolve upon the new colonel because he was the senior officer on the field. And in effect, veteran regimental commanders could do very little except watch helplessly while he tried to make decisions. The last great charge of the Irish Brigade took place at Gettysburg on July 2nd, the second day of the battle. Most of you, I think, will remember that the Union line forms a fishhook with a barb at Culp's Hill, coming around to Cemetery Hill. Snell goes down Cemetery Ridge to the Round Tops, which would be where the line was tied to the fishhook. It was a continuous line. One of the corps commanders, the commander of the 3rd Corps, was a New York general named named Sickles. Dan Sickles, interesting man, pretty rogue. Someday I'll do half an hour for you on Sickles, but we don't have time for that. Sickles decided that his ground was not good enough, so he advanced to the 3rd Corps, higher ground. So now instead of a line, an unbroken line, which the Confederates would attack, Sickles has presented them with a triangle. So they can hit him from 2 sides minimum. If they break anywhere, the Union line is broken. And of course, given the realities of combat, the 3rd Corps line was broken rather quickly. General Meade then ordered Hancock to send 2nd Corps troops to the support of the 3rd Corps. Hancock ordered Caldwell's division, probably the best division in the Corps, to do that sort of thing. On Cemetery Ridge, the Irish Brigade, which was part of Caldwell's division, paused for a moment, and the chaplain, Father Corby, who was later president of Notre Dame, blessed the troops, and for the only time in North American history, delivered a general absolution to the soldiers.
His picture's right up there.
Okay? I'm glad of that when we come back to that because I need to do that. A statue of Father Corby, with his hand raised in absolution, is in fact today on Cemetery Ridge, commemorating the event, and a duplicate stands on the campus of the University of Notre Dame. Students being students and Notre Dame being Notre Dame, anybody know what they call Corby? Faircatch Corby. Honoring the event and the brigade as Corby was doing this, General Hancock removed his hat, held it over his heart until the moment passed. Second in the line of Caldwell's brigades, Kelly and his Irishmen drove down the ridge into the wheat field where they blunted and stopped the Confederate advance, stabilized the line. Shortly thereafter, fresh Confederate troops came in, flanked the new line, and the brigade was forced to withdraw. Of the roughly 500 men who had received absolution, only about 300 came back up Cemetery Ridge. Again, about a 40% casualty rate. They had purchased time for the Army with their blood. They had slowed, briefly halted the rebel advance, and as the day closed, the Union line remained intact. It's at least arguable that Lee's best chance for victory at Gettysburg passed as July 2nd ended. Now, I'd like to make clear here, it is not simply the Irish Brigade. Okay? If any of you have seen the film Gettysburg, for example, you know of the work of the 20th Maine at the left of the Union line, a little round top. Although Gettysburg does not do justice, because that was part of Strong Vincent's brigade. Strong Vincent's brigade included the 44th New York, which was heavily recruited from Albany, and one entire company in which had been recruited from the Teachers College, which is now the university at Albany. There was, and then there's the 1st Minnesota. 1st Minnesota, by now, a regiment was down to 200 troops. It was in the middle of the line. It was to the right of the Irish Brigade. And a Confederate breakthrough was coming. And Hancock, who's the court man, says to the colonel of the 1st Minnesota, he said, "You see those colors? And those colors are representing like a brigade of Confederates coming up the hill." And he says, "Yes, sir." He says, "Take those colors." He knew that they weren't going to take the colors. And the commander of the 1st Minnesota knew they weren't going to take the colors. But they bought 10 or 15 minutes in which Hancock could bring up other troops to stabilize the line. So when I say the Union line remained intact, there was a lot of stuff happening. The Irish Brigade had died, with losses in 10 months from Antietam in September of '62, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg in July of 1863, had gutted the brigade. Elements of the brigade would always be with the Army of the Potomac. But if you look up here, you'll find another flag that speaks of the 69th Regiment as the 1st regiment of the 2nd Irish Brigade. Because the 1st is pretty well gone. About 2,000 regiments served in the Union Army between 1861 and 1865. Only 6 had heavier casualties than the 69th New York. And only 2 brigades in the Union Army had heavier casualties than the Irish Brigade. It is, I think, fair to say that while some units fought as well as the Irish Brigade, none fought better. Let me conclude with some verse written by Father Corby. The poem describes the regiments advancing behind those green flags with a harp of Ireland, shamrocks of Irish Catholicism, and a sunburst of the Fenian Brotherhood, emblazoned gold on green, green battle flags of the Irish Brigade. That old green flag, that Irish flag, it is now but a tattered rag. But India's store of precious ore hath not a gem worth that old flag. The worth of that old flag would seem to have been validated about a century later, in July of 1863, when Irish Americans were gathering on Cemetery Ridge to rededicate the statue to Father Corby. At the same moment, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, then the American president, was in Ireland. And there he presented to the Irish nation, as a symbol of the contribution of the Irish to America, one of the green battlefield flags of the Irish Brigade. Thank you.
Anybody have questions? Ed, you have the microphone.
Yeah.
Just raise your hand if you have questions you'd like.
Can you
I'm curious.
speak loudly so the people in back can hear you?
I think I'm in the same category with Tom. I can.
Okay, just project.
Probably a lot of people know it, but I've always been mystified. Why did the Irish colors change to the tricolor?
Oh, the tricolor is in fact designed to deal with modern Irish nationals. So the orange represents the north, the green represents the south, and the white is hope.
And when was that? After 1922 or something?
Certainly after the creation of the Irish Free State and the proclamation of the Irish Republic.
Because growing up in Boston, the hop flag to me was the Irish flag. and then all of a sudden it disappeared, and I never understood why.
Part of it is the breakdown among Irish national groups, so that the Irish Republican Army was not always on speaking terms with various other elements, and so the sort of panache which had been associated with the Fenian movement was lost in that internecine conflict as to who had the right way to establish Irish nationalism.
Professor, I got a question for you. It's not a question. I just want to ask you if you can confirm what I read one time. It said that when they were surrendering at Appomattox Courthouse there, when Lee's contingent came in there and Grant's contingent was there was about 15 or 16 guys, I guess. They were standing outside by the picket fence, and the rebels said to the only reason you guys won is because you had more Irish than us. Is there any truth to that?
I'm sure it seemed that way to a number of people who were Irish. There are places in the Civil War. There's one case where, in fact, the Irish Brigade is charging, and the portion of the line being held is held by a Confederate Irish regiment. And Lee was nervous enough to position other Confederate troops behind them just in case. But the Irish, being Irish, they killed one another without compunction. The great English essayist Chesterton wrote a wonderful line. He said, "The great Gaels of Ireland are the men that God made mad. For all their wars are happy, and all their songs are sad." And I think somewhere in there lies that story.
Here?
Yes. Did members of this brigade return to Ireland?
No.
And engage in?
No. Whatever the thoughts when the Irish Brigade was formed, as in any really great and long-lasting war, virtually all the people who had served had about all the war they wanted. Sir. Oh, man. Sir, somebody, I saw a hand.
You, sir.
No, not on. Well, Professor, obviously Catholic prejudice was still very real at this point in the American Republic. How was that dealt with a Catholic chaplain in the Army at that time?
Well, the Irish were allowed to have their own chaplains and that sort of stuff. As a general rule, that's about the only formal concession that was made. I am reasonably sure, although it wasn't written down, that, for example, a corps commander like Hancock would be much too wise to brigade the Irish Brigade in a division commanded by somebody who's in a know-nothing, for example. There were a number of commanders, for example, Winfield Scott, even in the Mexican War, because he had Irish troops and also because he wanted to keep the Mexicans reasonably happy, required, for example, his soldiers, when a priest went through the streets carrying communion, with the bell ringing and so on, they were to remove their hats and that sort of stuff. In fact, he got in a fair amount of political trouble for it, given. There were men as wise and as sophisticated, as well as stupid and unsophisticated as in our own time. So much of that, I think, was dealt with. And certainly the Irish came away in the same sense that, let's say, the Japanese who fought with 442nd Regimental Combat Team in World War II did, with an increased recognition. Whatever else may be said, nobody can question their valor. And this is a world in which, if you read the letter back home, after 3 years, the whole army can go home. They enlisted for 3 years. It's not like World War II. And a lot of them are thinking about going home. And their wives are writing to them saying, "Hey, John, you got to get back here. You know, I really can't do this farm, and I just want to have you back here in one piece," and whatever. And they all, there's a, not all, but there's a thread goes through the correspondence, it would not be manly for me to do that. So the display of valor confirms one's manliness, at least at several levels. So I think there is some progress as a result of it, but it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be no Irish need to apply ads in the paper in 1870. Yes, sir.
Why were there so many Irish that come to America?
Well, they had to go somewhere. They couldn't stay in Ireland because they were starving to death. The English had laws that made it very difficult for the Irish to survive. For example, silly example, but reason important. No Irishman, according to English law, could own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. So if you had a champion racehorse, any English Protestant could come up to you, give you 5 pounds, and take it away. And you could not claim you had been robbed because no Irishman could own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. If your younger brother became a Protestant, he would inherit your father's land instead of you. By the time you come to the famine in the 1840s, which is when the great numbers had already come, an Irishman is lucky if he has tenancy on as much as 2-3 acres. That's why they lived on potatoes, because they're the only thing they could grow enough of. Potatoes and milk, if you got a goat, a couple of other things, potatoes and milk will keep you alive. It's only when the potato crop goes bad. When the potato crop went bad, they had no choice but to go. There are stories, haunting stories, of women and children on the side of the road, and their mouths are ringed with green because they've been eating weeds, trying to get some. So the reason they left was because they had to leave. Someone went to Canada, some went to Australia, a lot had proceeded to go to Australia as convicts on prison ships, because one of the things they did with Irish rebels was, in fact, our friend Mar the Sword, after the 1848 uprising, had been condemned to death, but then it had been commuted, he had been transported to Australia, which he escaped and came to San Francisco. I think we have time for one more, and then...
Good, time for 2 more. Go ahead, right there.
Professor, can you talk a little bit about the Irish and the draft riots?
Sure. The draft riots of 1863, and incidentally, there was a pretty good one in Troy, which was put down by the priests. Otherwise, they might have had some troops there too. There was a great draft riot in New York. Draft was instituted, Confederates had done it earlier, but no American had ever been drafted. There was what they called a militia draft. For example, in the American Revolution, you might say, I got to have 10 men to your town. If you don't get 10 men, you only get 8. Then the other guys in the militia company will pick 2, the 2 they like the least, and send them on. But this is the first time the national government has sought to conscript people. The Irish basically are saying, rich man's war and poor man's fight. Because if you were drafted and you could afford $300, you could buy your way out of the draft. Now, you could be called again the next year. The other thing you could do is you could buy a substitute if you had no money. So, for example, if you gave somebody $1,000, he would enlist, and your name would be equivalent to you having gone. So, rich man's war, poor man's fight. The Irish hated blacks because the Irish in New York City, which also had a very significant population of free blacks, they were in direct economic competition. The jobs that both groups were looking for were jobs that didn't possess any skills, manual labor. Remember the old story about the Irish just long ago? They carried hods, they carried up the brick for skilled workers, masons, and the song goes, it must have been the Irish that built the pyramids, because no one else could carry up the brick. So the result then is they feel terribly put upon. There is some strong probability of some secessionist activity, but I don't think it really was terribly significant. And there is 3 days of blood in the streets, and they burn black orphanages, they hang blacks from lampposts. I mean, it is not a pretty episode in Irish American history. Not a pretty episode at all. But and then they had to take troops, some of which would come directly from Gettysburg, put down the draft line.
And one last question right here.
Yeah, New York State has, I think, the best collection of Civil War regimental flags.
Yes.
and some of which are on display at the state capitol right now.
Most of them are being conserved up inside.
In Saratoga, do you know if we could go up the hill here and see one of those beautiful green flags of the 69th or 67th?
I do not know whether any of the flags in there are there or not. My guess is you could, somebody knew. Jack?
69th is restored, it's up in the cap.
The answer is yes.
I was going to say if Jack McEnany's here, he'd tell you.
Again, thank you all for your
Hey, how about...
Before we all disperse, we have a gift for Professor Kelly. We are the only museum in the United States to have exhibited at the National Library in Dublin. We did this in 2006. It's a photographic essay, about 57 prints, maybe 63 actually. And it's an exhibit about Dublin then, back in the early 1960s, the late 50s and 60s. We sent a photographer over to Ireland to capture the same scenes 40 years later, during the height of the Celtic Tiger, and to show the transformation of life in Ireland. And from that exhibit, Jack would like to present Professor Kelly with a print from that exhibit.
I have, as it turns out, a picture at home of the town square with the Celtic cross all cut up on the grid of the village from which my grandfather came. This will go back.
Thank you very much.
One of the things...
How is Ireland today? One state.
Pardon?
How is Ireland now?
Different. Terribly different. Prosperity alters many things. You've had a long period of prosperity with the Celtic Tiger. You've had a lot of return of Irish, for example, the last time I was there in the early years of this century, they were enticing Irishmen with skill back, for example, from Germany, places where they had